All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Co-opting AI. It is wonderful to have you here with us today. My name is Mona Sloane. I am an assistant professor of data science and media studies here at the University of Virginia. I study the social embeddedness of AI systems, and I am the host of the Co-opting AI series. Welcome to our first Co-opting AI event in 2026. It is hard to believe, but we are actually entering our 7th year of this series, and I am, as always, extremely grateful for the generous and continued support of our teams and leaders at the Digital Technology for Democracy Lab at the University of Virginia and the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. We could never do what we're doing without them. Now, our world with AI is in constant and rapid change. This sense of acceleration is, of course, not novel. We can often see it accompanying infrastructural changes that are brought about by other new technologies. But let's stay with AI for a moment. Just last week, as some of us, or maybe many of us, probably saw, were in awe of, or terrified of, a new social media platform emerged called Maltbook, a social media platform created entirely for so-called agentic AI assistants that are deployed by their owners across those owners' intimate and varied tech stacks, from emails to calendars, texts, and more. These agents that are signed up are now talking to each other on Maltbook without human oversight in a Reddit sort of fashion. Allegedly, they've already created a religion and they talk about avoiding the surveillance from their human owners. While some of the potential security issues of agentic AI, I think, are on full display here, Will Haven from the MIT Tech Review called this peak AI theater because some agentic bots were actually people posing as bots, but also because most that happens on Maltbook is more akin to perhaps play or gaming. Now, when we hear about, think about, or engage with these peak moments of AI, we sometimes forget one group who is often and consistently on the front line of technology innovation, use, and actually policy, and that is kids. Thinking of AI and kids quite often leads to facing some of the deep-seated changes that are perhaps afoot in education as AI becomes integrated into classrooms as an epistemic technology. So a technology that actively co-produces knowledge, truth, or facts about the world. We're both excited about new access opportunities and concerned about potential risks like cognitive atrophy, loss of human connection, or the re-solidification of existing inequalities in our education system. Outside of the classroom, kids are constantly engaging with AI too. Increasingly, that happens through generative AI, as I'm sure we will hear more about in our conversation today. Kids can be, and no surprise here, incredibly creative in their AI use and develop new forms of play and social engagement with their peers with and through some of these systems. At the same time, however, we know of devastating cases of teenage suicide after intense chatbot interaction, and we know of deepfake pornography shared in schools as well. The concern for youth mental health in relation to digital systems has led to cell phone bans in schools in some US states and a full social media ban for kids in Australia. The often invasive data collection that accompanies the development and deployment of AI systems has also caused privacy harms for kids. For example, at the end of last year, Disney settled a children's privacy case with a $10 million payment. The complaint alleged Disney collected information from and targeted toward children on YouTube without parental notice or consent. Now, Kids don't have a seat at the table when AI is designed and policy decisions are made. And the question is, could this ever happen? And what would that look like? So we kind of have to ask, in our brave new world with AI, are the kids all right? And I think there is no better group of experts to explore this question than my guests today. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to Co-opting AI, Annabelle Blake, Sonia Livingstone, and my dear UVA colleague, Ashleigh Wade. Starting us off today for our session on co-opting AI kids will be Sonia Livingstone, who is a professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the alumna School of Economics and Political Science. Taking a comparative, critical, and contextualized approach, her research examines how the changing conditions of mediation are reshaping everyday practices and possibilities for action. Much of Sonia's time is concerned with children's right in the digital age. She has published 20 books on media audiences, especially children and young people's risks and opportunities, media literacy and rights in the digital environment, and more. Her new book is Parenting for a Digital Future, How Hopes and Fears About Technology Shape Children's Lives, together with Alicia Bloom-Ross with the University of Oxford Press. She has received many honors. She has advised the UK government, the European Commission, the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, and many others on children's internet safety and rights in the digital environment. She's also the director of Digital Futures for Children, which is a joint LSE and Five Roads Foundation Research Center. Thank you so much, Sonia, for joining us. Following Sonia will be Ashleigh Wade, who is an associate professor of digital studies here at the University of Virginia, where she's jointly appointed in the media studies and the African American studies departments. Broadly speaking, Ashleigh's work traverses the fields of Black girlhood studies, digital and visual media studies, Black feminist theory, and the digital humanities. She has a PhD in women's and gender studies from Rutgers University and is an alumna of the Carter Woodson Institute for African American Studies Fellowship Program. Her work on digital Blackness appears in the Black Scholar, National Political Science Review, Women, Gender, and Families of Color, Visual Arts Research, and many more. She also has a book out called Girl Autopoetics, Agency and Possibility in Everyday Digital Practice with Duke University Press, which explores the role of Black girls' digital practices in documenting and preserving everyday Black life. And closing us out today from the other side of the globe, where it is already Thursday morning, will be Annabelle Blake, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney, researching children and AI. They are also a principal design researcher at Canva. And over the past decade, they have worked in Google's Creative Lab, experimenting with emerging technologies, authored award-winning children's books, and competed internationally on the freestyle skiing World Cup circuit. Their practice is grounded in taking play seriously. Shaped by backgrounds in psychology, design, and extreme sports, their research explores how young people engage in risky and experimental play with emerging technologies. They are particularly interested in how elevating youth voices can orient technology teams toward designing more playful, child-centered experiences. Now you can see why I'm extremely delighted to have these experts with me today to talk about AI and kids. Before I hand it over to Ashleigh, a few logistical details. Those of you who have been in co-opting AI conversations before, you know, you can put your questions to our experts into the Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen, and we will fold these into the conversation as we go. And with that, I'm going to shut up and hand it over to Sonia. Thank you all for joining us today.
Fantastic. Mona, thank you so much for the invitation, and what a pleasure to be here also with Ashleigh and Annabelle and everyone here who is listening and watching wherever they might be in the world. So as Mona said, generative AI has burst into what was already a pretty kind of fraught landscape regarding digital technologies and children. And we were struggling with a whole series of challenges. And suddenly, I think many people have pivoted to thinking about AI, especially generative AI, and trying to kind of navigate a way through this. So the work that we did and the work that I do at the Digital Futures for Children Centre is very much framed in a child rights focus, and that's what I want to talk about in my kind of remarks today, and try to build a link between regulation, children's rights, and the lived realities of children in different parts of the world. A child rights focus already requires that we think globally, if that's not too kind of arrogant, but that we think broadly. And it asks some pretty normative questions. It asks, what does good look like for children in the world, in a digital world, in an AI-enabled world? So, this is not a moment to kind of come to any conclusions because we're in the very early days and so much is happening and so much is changing fast. But I think what I want to say in my provocation is even though we don't know how things are going in great depth and detail yet, and we don't know how things are going to turn out, we have some criteria by which to judge what is happening. And a child rights framework for me kind of offers that judgment. And so too does talking with and doing research with children and young people. So the work that we've been doing draws on different kinds of resources. So one, for example, is that we have consulted the Five Rights Foundation's global youth ambassadors. They have youth ambassadors from many countries as a child advocacy organization, and we kind of have been consulting them to see how they see things now. What are the differences in different parts of the world? What is the different, what do they anticipate? And then we did qualitative work with partners in Brazil, in Kenya, in India, and in Thailand, and actually just published yesterday for Safer Internet Day, also in Europe. And we're trying to kind of listen out really for what are the varieties of experience, what are the different ways in which different contexts matter when we talk about something as kind of generic as children's rights, and where might be sufficient commonalities to kind of build some international regulation. Where does that really need to be tailored differently in different parts of the world? I would love to name all my colleagues who have worked with me on this. I do not do global work by myself, and I probably don't have time in my remaining minutes, but I really want to kind of credit this as a very kind of international partnership. One reason for starting with the child rights approach is its very absence in what has been a burgeoning of debates about regulation, ethics, and even human rights in relation to digital technologies and most recently AI. So every time I see a new plan for responsible AI, for new ethical AI, I kind of do a quick word search on child and young and minor and adolescent and a whole set of, they're just not there. I mean, it is extraordinary um, uh, how many thoughtful policies are being developed with words like ethical and responsible and even human rights that assume that everyone is an adult. And so it seems to me just so crucial to kind of bring the lived reality of children. When children are noticed, they tend to be noticed primarily from the West, from the global North. So there's a kind of enormous imbalance in which children might be heard. And they tend to be noticed, if at all, only in relation to their kind of vulnerability or their victim status in need of protection. And so the advantage of a child rights framework is really to kind of emphasize children's right to be heard, to participate in this world, to be agents in this world. Education is a priority and actually a big driver of AI in so many parts of the world, and yet people don't talk about children as the beneficiaries of education, and we don't have good evidence yet that AI is benefiting their education. We're getting a lot more evidence quite rapidly hitting the headlines about where the problems lie. So what's important about, working within the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is it recognizes all human rights that apply to everybody. It adds those that pay particular attention to the way in which children are developing, or in rights language, kind of their evolving capacities must be considered. It pays particular attention to recognizing their rights vis-a-vis their parents, which is one of the super contested things around the world. And often people imagine that we don't need to worry about children in an AI world because that's their parents' problem. Their parents can deal with it, or maybe their schools can educate them enough, and then they'll be like little adults, perhaps. So there's a whole series of kind of injustices that don't get noticed, and those injustices are both the harms that happen to children precisely because they are children, and also the ways in which they miss out on the opportunities and they don't get included in a lot of the resources, a lot of the planning, and a lot of the kind of enabling that is happening in relation to AI. And yet, Mona, as you just said, they are often the early adopters. They're often the most kind of experimental, kind of getting going. And somehow they are at the front line of what is yet another era of moving fast and breaking things. And we are seeing, I think, every week there's the kind of new set of headlines. And I think of things that are going wrong. So in Britain right now, everyone is discussing, can we make the nudification apps illegal? Can we make the kind of the AI that, that is generating child abuse images illegal? What can we do? We are kind of multiplying regulations in a way that is probably unwieldy. And we're doing so much of it after the fact, as it were, after the tools have been developed, after they've been deployed, after they've been wheeled out into the marketplace, after we've been surprised at the problems, as if we can't anticipate the ways in which tools can be misused and abused. And we are seeing, therefore, quite a substantial level of disquiet from the public. Whether that's ever enough to generate a break on the market, to sow a doubt in the minds of those who are, running to the venture capitalists and planning to make vast profits from AI. I don't know. I'm actually curious because I'm hearing a lot of concern, but also, and I want to kind of respect what it is that the children told us in the interviews in different parts of the world. Their responses are often very nuanced. They are curious. They are trying it out. They're trying it out in parts of the world where we were told no need to do interviews in Kenya or India, or they haven't got any. They're absolutely, when they get access to technology, when they can find connectivity, when they get a chance, kids are absolutely kind of curious and exploratory in what they can find and what they want to do. But and they, I think what I would love to convey to them is it's not a binary. It's not, there are benefits and there are risks, and kids are somehow squished in the middle. They are kind of navigating um, with adults, but also with each other, what that different world could be. They're often, I think, braver than adults. I would like to kind of sometimes put it all in a box and say stop, but they are brave, they are intrigued, they are kind of finding ways, and they are dismayed at a lot of what, frankly, adults do. They're dismayed at the violence, at the racism, at the ways in which AI kind of excludes them unthinkingly because it's I don't know, it's for people who can type, or people who can speak English, or for people who have high incomes and lots of connectivity. A whole set of ways in which they're just dismayed at feeling themselves othered and kind of put on the wrong side, and yet they are so often the kind of the brave ones finding their way through. So there are a whole series of rights that are getting infringed right now and in the future, unless we really do take a kind of holistic approach to children's rights baked in from the start. So I'm really looking forward to what I know Annabelle is going to say something about design and just thinking about how we can start anticipating the diversity of users, and that includes young users and their very distinct rights and needs, and know that they are going to be kind of there in that front line exploring whether we get it right or not. So they are also in line for considerable harm. I can see lots of kind of positive steps. The big UN organizations in just the last few weeks put out a joint statement saying this is what a child rights respecting AI world looks like. This came from the Committee on the Rights of the Child, from the International Telecommunication Union, from UNICEF, and all the kind of big ones. They put out their statement. I would say let's read it, let's think about it, let's debate it, let's see what's feasible, take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for setting the scene and sharing your research and your insight with us. I'm going to hand it over to Ashleigh, who will tell us more about her work on Black girlhood and social media. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Mona, for inviting me. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you all today. And I'm just gonna preface my comments by saying that like my work focuses primarily on social media. So like as I'm talking about social media and content creation, I'm not conflating social media and AI, but recognizing the ways that the two are linked together. And so usually when I'm in front of a new crowd, I like to talk a little bit about how I got into doing the research that I do, which focuses on Black people, especially Black girls, in digital spaces. And I will get to that in a second, but I just wanted to share a quick anecdote that I think is relevant to what Sonia was just talking about in terms of thinking about rights and regulations around social media and AI. And so yesterday, my husband called me when he was on his way to work. He was listening to a morning show, and the hosts were talking about one of several lawsuits against Meta around the failure to protect children on social media. And this specific one that he was referring to was the one brought forth by New Mexico's Attorney General. And it was alleging that Meta was knowingly putting children at risk for sexual exploitation. And so the suit was filed back in 2023, but the trial just started this past Monday. And that's why they were talking about it on this morning show. And so he asked me, "Isn't this what your book is about, your new book?" And so I wasn't surprised that he remembered what my next book is going to be about because I talk his head off about it all the time. But the work that I'm working on right now is about the various ways that children are laboring on social media as content creators. And I think that the news stories that have come up recently around children and social media give us a good context for this conversation, but I think it also helps to situate what some might see as a shift in my approach to discussing children and social media. So now I'll go back and give some background. So I came to this work by like virtue of my career trajectory. So a long time ago, I was a high school teacher, and I remember being pretty young. I started teaching high school when I was right out of undergrad, like 22. And so like my second teaching job, I think I might have been 24, 25 when I started. And so I remember hearing veteran teachers like complaining about, oh, they're always on their phones, they're always, on social media, and it's bad for them. And I was not convinced that social media was inherently bad for these students, especially because with the girls that I saw and interacted with every day, social media spaces seem to be providing spaces of belonging for Black girls that did not necessarily exist in the school space. And so I wanted to learn from Black girls exactly what their motivations and aspirations were for using social media. And so that is how I ended up with the book Black Girl Autopoetics, Agency and Everyday Digital Practice. And that book both explores and celebrates Black girls' agency in documenting their stories, their passions, their concerns, and just their everyday lives through social media. And one of the, I think, key features of Black Girl Autopoetics is that it is a celebratory text. But it also is a text that focuses on teenagers. It focuses on middle school and high school age Black girls, girls who are old enough to actually meet the minimum age requirements of these social media platforms. But as I was researching for Black Girl Autopoetics, there was always this kind of nagging question or like voice in the back of my mind about the ethical implications for younger girls and younger children more generally using social media. And I'm especially talking about children who aren't old enough to read, aren't old enough to sometimes talk. And so, what it means for these children to have their own social media platforms on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, etc. And I can't really pinpoint an exact timeline of how I started going down this rabbit hole of like Black family vloggers and child content creators. But I remember having a conversation with a colleague pretty on in my research about little Black girls online. And when I say little Black girls, I mean like girls under 10. And specifically, we were talking about this child content creator named Jade. Jade has been on social media. Jade is, I think she's 10 now. She's been on social media since she was 7 months old. When her mom posted a video of her saying her first word, which is super early to say your first word. And I think that was part of the fascination of like watching Jade's content. At least for me, it was like I was fascinated by her intelligence, her vocabulary at such a young age. And I thought the content was cute. And when the pandemic first started, I was, like many people, very desperate to find content that wasn't going to make my chest tight with anxiety. So I started watching more and more content like Jade's. And eventually, the algorithms work their magic, and like almost all of my content that popped up in my news feed and like suggested reels on Instagram was from child content creators that were under the age of 10. And so for a little while, the dopamine boost of seeing cute kids drowned out that nagging question in the back of my mind. But the ways that social media platforms have changed so much, especially within the last, 2 to 5 years, um, really made me unable to ignore that for much longer. And so I just started allowing myself to ask, why are social media platforms so eager to overlook accounts that clearly belong to children that don't meet the minimum age requirements? And a lot of times these accounts have like a disclaimer that will say, oh, pages managed by parent or legal guardian. But it's very obvious that the we are meant to believe that this is that child's content. And so the other thing that I found striking in the bios of these profiles is a lot of times they would be described as toddler influencers. And so that made me ask, well, who are toddlers influencing? Like, who's the audience of toddler influencer content or kidfluencer content? And why is that acceptable? Why is it acceptable for a 2-year-old to have a social media presence? And so I think that, as Sonia pointed out in her discussion, like more and more scholars, policymakers, and educators are asking questions about the ethics of children and social media, and especially around like the concept of content creation or kidfluencing. Um, and I think a lot of this discourse focuses on outlining the potential harms of these platforms. But from what I've read, when people are talking about exploitation specifically, a lot of that conversation is around financial exploitation. And it doesn't necessarily look at the companies themselves. It puts more of the onus on the parent or the family, like whoever the adult is that's managing these children's accounts. Those are the people who are responsible for protecting them from exploitation. And so one of the reasons why the lawsuit that I mentioned at the beginning is so important is because it actually addresses the platform itself beyond just thinking about, oh, well, it's the parent's responsibility to protect the child from X, Y, and Z. And so um, I'll just kind of leave us with a few like questions to think about as we're thinking about ways that we might try to hold platforms accountable for the ways that children's rights are violated through social media. So, how do we think about the exploitation of child content creators in ways that hold these companies accountable? What kinds of data are companies collecting from kidfluencers? Um, and how are they using it? And I'm especially concerned about this when we're talking about children from marginalized populations. Um, how are AI models being trained on kidfluencer content? And then what kinds of algorithmic injustices are at play as this content is distributed? And then just kind of how can we think about more robust policy recommendations that account for data exploitation in addition to the financial exploitation that might occur from child content creation?
Thank you so much, Ashley. Much appreciated, and much appreciated that you let us hear about your emerging research and your new book, which sounds very exciting. Annabelle, tell us more about your work.
All right. Hi, everyone. First of all, I just want to say I'm just already so energized by what you were just saying, Sonia. I'm so aligned with getting young people more involved in our processes of designing. And also, Ashley, I'm so glad that you're here because as I hope we can talk about more later, I think it's so important that we continue to draw a thread between the technology that already exists and what young people are doing. And even though AI can feel so new today, so I'm just so excited to get into that. I do have slides today. I do work at Canva, so I definitely I definitely brought some slides with me. Mona, can you see the slides on? Great. Great, great, great. Well, hello everyone. I've got a little megaphone here because I am from Sydney, so I'm hoping that this provocation can carry all across over the world. And that provocation today that I really want to talk about is this gripe I have with language that we use. And I want to talk about how not all chatbots are companions. I'm going to particularly pull this provocation from my recent research, particularly in my PhD, some of which was out last year, some that's coming out very soon at CHI, where I've been understanding and exploring how young people use AI chatbots. So I really want to pick this apart because media and tech companies love talking about AI companionship or friendship, but I really think this is a limiting and incomplete definition. And I think it's having very real damage to ourselves as practitioners and also on young people because as a result, I think we're really missing out on some very specific and unique harms that are amplified by this kind of AI. But also what makes me most sad is we're missing out on opportunities to design something much better. So, like me, you've probably seen a lot of materials like this in the last few years. Companion AI is really widely used in product marketing. It's a very compelling value proposition, and it is often used to sell and position simulated empathy as a solution to this like loneliness epidemic. And today I'm really going to focus on this kind of like digital companionship these products rather than robots or plushies or toys, mainly because this kind of product is highly accessible, mostly free, young people can use on their phones. But yeah, we might talk about those other forms as well later on. And this idea of companionship was really amplified by the media, and I understand why. This like message around people falling in love and making friends with chatbots, it's really easy to understand. It's a conceptual shortcut, and it's incredibly alarming to read. So like I definitely get goosebumps when we hear about the devastating outcomes that this use has been linked to. But what makes me give, pause here is that these instances of AI use that is driven by loneliness or a desire for romance, whilst they're really meaningful and important to highlight, they actually account for a very small percentage of motivations as to why young people are using this technology. So, research for romance and sex coming in bottom in a motivation. This is just one recent study, for example, for teens, and then loneliness alleviation coming in, also just sort of behind it, but underneath the bulk of these different use cases. So, I think we need to really break out of this like echo chamber a little bit if we want to understand what else young people are doing. And to do that, we really need to break out of, I think, this language of companionship. When we do that, when we break out, we see that entertainment, this is not a surprise when you work with young people, but entertainment is a huge motivator for using this technology. It's really fun. It can be really fun. But these entertainment use cases don't always neatly fit inside this framework of AI companionship and research. And just like as one example, even when you ask young people about companionship, you bring them into this study, you say, we're going to talk about companionship, and then you ask them, by the way, how do you view companions? We get a lot of answers from them that don't actually really map onto that idea of friendship. They talk about role playing or imaginative scenarios. They say, actually, it's a tool or a program, or none of these are a fit, or I don't use it in this way. And so that really, I need to scratch that itch in my research to understand, well, what is happening here that is not captured by this sort of this box that we're, I think, quite prematurely applying this technology. Because, again, I've got my megaphone out. I think if we narrowly define these tools as companionship and we really focus on friendship instead of fun, then we're missing a much bigger and richer picture. And I am a big fan of fun, so this has really been the focus of my research early on, which brings me great delight because it makes for a very, very fun PhD. So I'm going to share just some insights from the most recent paper that has primarily focused on listening to young people using character AI. If you haven't heard of character AI, it's a perfect platform for understanding emergent practice in youth technology behaviors. Because it has over 10 million chatbots. It has many, many users, many of which are young people. They can make their own characters. So we really see this emergent sort of use case rather than prescriptive. There's games, there's content that is, a lot of it is actually from, you can find stuff from preschool media. So it's very targeted at kids, has a really big TikTok following, so huge reach. And we listened to a very, very active Discord server that is official for that channel, where there were a lot of young people talking about their practice. We sampled just, a few thousand, and from that we found that around half of them identified as teenagers or self-identified as teenagers. And we really listened in on what they were doing and what they were talking about. And we saw so many different chatbots. We saw ranges of chatbots from a sassy block of cheese to a game character that would comfort you when you're on your period, summer camps for troubled teens, people who are putting two warring countries in a chat together, making clones of themselves, sort of games where you can like try and babysitter challenging kid, cartoon characters from TV shows, videos that they like, using kidnapper bots, so this like transgressive play, or like real characters that young people have said are in their own lives for these sort of like role plays that have quite an emotional lens to them. There were so many. We did some analysis and we distilled them into different archetypes. And we found this a useful framework because when we looked at these archetypes, we saw that there were so many behaviors that were counter to or like a slightly adjacent behavior to this sort of friendship that we talk about. And in my last sort of few minutes, I'm really just going to focus on 3 of those today, and then maybe we can talk about some more anecdotes later on. So the first archetype that I want to talk about is a soother. So here young people are talking about comfort bots, and a lot of the examples we saw were using these comfort bots for subclinical issues, things like worrying about a math test, moving house, or having a period and wanting some comfort during that. And these really don't look like your typical AI therapist. We did not take a therapist from the real world and then make it into a chatbot. It's really blended with entertainment, highly personalized. They're picking their favorite characters that they find comfort in their media, and then they're interacting with them for their sort of daily or like time-boxed issues. The next archetype we saw is a dark soul. You might have heard of sycophantic AI that's very, very agreeable. These characters are not that. They're morally complex, emotionally intense characters like toxic best friends or characters with traumatic backstories. And these are, we saw, often designed for angsty play. Young people wanted to feel something. They talked about wanting to cry. They're bored. If you don't cry when you're talking to a character, that's not a good character. So they're really seeking out this like emotionally heightened experience, and that's what they're designing. And then the last archetype I'm going to talk about is narrator. So it's not a one character, with one voice. It's one chatbot window, but it represents a whole cast of characters. It has a lot of narrative dialogue, like longer text. And in this, we saw a lot of like cross-platform use where young people were sort of writing, like they said, long books in these chat windows, and then they're publishing them on Wattpad. They're saying this has really helped improve my creative confidence. We're seeing transfer effects where they're like, oh, I feel so much more confident in my writing outside of this. I will say as well, particularly this group of people were already coming to this platform, loving reading, loving writing. So this was just like another medium for them to express that hobby of theirs. So I hope that this has demonstrated that young people use platforms like Character AI when they can design their own characters in really surprising and unexpected ways. They really don't always fit that framework of a best friend. But if we really narrowly define, prematurely again, like this definition by this, then we're missing out on all of these experiences young people are designing, that they're rotating through, and they're sort of figuring out, like as we are, they're figuring out what this technology is good for. And that, I'm particularly interested as a design practitioner because that really stifles our capacity as technologists to evaluate specific risks to this technology, but also, the ideas that we should be designing for. And I'm keen to also hear like Sonia's take on this, but I think it makes regulation and public communication, I'm a parent as well, like really confusing because, in Australia, we use the word companion to be very broad. We talk about it being fitness coaches to, tools designed to help you practice new tools. But in the Washington bill, we say actually it's all these use cases except for in-game, except for designs that were designed for playing. So there's a lot of difference there in the types of experiences young people can have. But I also think more importantly, we miss really emergent signs in this particular data set that came through that showed us service and support gaps that need attention and that we can solve not through technology, but through like better community access. We've got examples here of a number of chatbots around trans affirming period support. So young people are telling us something here in what they're designing, and we should look to that as a source of innovation. I think that's really my time now, Mona, and I'm really keen to look at the questions and talk about this with Ashleigh and Sonia a little bit more.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Annabelle, for bringing this unique insight into your research and into the world of creative use of generative AI systems among youth. Much appreciated. So I kind of see a few threads across these contributions. One is particularly thick, if you will. And I feel that that's the one of old concepts not necessarily serving us very well when we're trying to understand the lived experience of children in the context of digital systems, whether that is, Sonia, you spoke about, kids are braver than adults and are dismayed by the worlds that adults create and are quite exploratory in their own research, if you will, into these systems. And there are, concepts that inform regulation that lead to duplicates and that sort of steer us more away from more effective investigations of what is going on and how we can mitigate some of these harms. And then Ashleigh, you spoke about, I was really struck when you said the algorithm did its magic and I had all these kidfluencers in my feed. And that sort of was a little bit of a moment for me there when you spoke, because the algorithmic problem of amplification and optimization, which is different from data, right? When we talk about AI problems, we always say garbage in, garbage out. That seems to be insufficient because we are, dealing with invasive data collection for optimization and optimization within algorithmic systems. So that is also something that is a concept that is well established, right? And that is not a new problem. We've been talking about this for at least concretely a decade about algorithmic harms. And then Annabelle, you also said, well, we have a concept that is broad and doesn't do us any service. We're actually perhaps even on purpose missing all the nuance, and we are steering ourselves away from agency and respect, perhaps, which is the intention of regulation that is sort of operating in adult world, right? And so I felt that these were some of the connecting points. So I have a few questions for you, but while I articulate those, I'm inviting our audience members to put theirs into the Q&A box, and I will start asking them. So Sonia, I'm just going to take Annabelle's sort of cue. You spoke about AI uses by children in places that tend to generally not be on the radar because we are living in a world in which longstanding inequalities, including our perception of the world and who matters, influence that. Can you share a few of those, especially based on the collaborative research that you described earlier in your contribution, which I think included research in Kenya and Brazil and a few other places?
Yes. I think, when we hear a lot of worries about AI or about the digital world, the easy assumption is that children's lives are great otherwise offline and everything's happy and they're being sucked into this problematic world. And of course, I don't want to compare, but their children are living with a lot of problems around the world. So I guess thinking about what colleagues wanted to offer from their insights in different countries. I mean, my colleagues in Kenya, the team was led by Jennifer Kaberi, and they talked a lot about dealing with everything speaking to them in English, which is, not the language that many children speak. So there is a kind of language issues. They talked about getting images of white people when they ask for photos, which is just, so they were, they both, the services don't meet the needs they have, but they also kind of reinforce the problems that they are living with already offline, as it were, in the world. They're already living with racism. They're already living with a kind of, a colonial or post-colonial system. They're already contending with it, and they go online and they kind of find it intensified, as well as finding a lot of the educational opportunities and information and answers to questions. I appreciated Annabelle's kind of effort not to polarize, but to kind of to recognize some of the really genuine reasons why kids are intrigued and want to know and want to have fun. So often they live lives which are quite strict, which are quite full of kind of judging adults, and the world of chatbots and companion AI and so on seems very different, much friendlier, much more open. Um, so yeah, we mustn't romanticize what is going on offline, but it makes it kind of, yeah, but often the problems get repeated and kind of extended.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that I think is certainly also something that at least those of us who are educators in one way or the other can certainly relate to. Ashley, you spoke about your previous career as a high school teacher and how it inspired your research. And there seems to be a sort of direct connection here, right? Falling on from what Sonia said, and then you found in your work that there were places of creation, refuge, celebration. You spoke of your book as a celebratory text, which I found really quite intriguing and that really resonated with me. So when we recognize that worlds in which children live that are, that we don't look at through the lens of AI are already stressful for them. And they sort of seek out technologies partially to have fun, partially perhaps to create alternative spaces. As you sort of observe that in your research, both on sort of social media and Black girlhood, and now more on kidfluencers, are these actors aware of the algorithmic mediation, or what forms of algorithmic mediation are they aware of?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that came up a lot when I was doing the research for Black Girl Autopoetics. Like people would often ask me, like, well, are the girls that you're talking to aware of algorithms and like, how people are seeing their content, or like who is it even reaching because of the algorithms? And I think that question is indicative of why I think differently about the girls that I researched for the first book and the kidfluencers that I'm researching now. Because I do think that, like, especially the high school age girls that I worked with before were very aware of the algorithms. And they talked to me about how they would play with, like, the way that they posted their content in different spaces as a result of this awareness of the platform affordances. I do think also during the time that I was doing the research for the first book, so it was I started the research in like 2015, so like from 2015 to 2020. And so that's like I ended the research like right before TikTok became like super popular in the US. And so I think that makes a difference too in terms of like thinking about the relationship between my research participants and like their kind of algorithmic knowledge. And so, but I think that they still have more of an understanding than the children who I come across who are, maybe 4 years old or 5 years old or even younger than that, right? Like if a child is not old enough to even talk, then it's kind of hard to um, assess like what they understand about when their parent is recording them and where they're posting this recording and who's interacting with it. And sometimes parents will say in the comments, like, oh, well, I'll just use Jade as an example, but Jade asked me to post this video and she wanted to know what you guys thought about X, Y, and Z. And so, like, we see that sometimes too, but we can't really know if, like, we can't really know certain children's understanding of algorithms because they don't necessarily have the language for it. And so I think so that's one of the reasons why the tone of this research is a little different from the first one, because the first one is about Black girls not being victims of technology and being agential um, in the ways that they use technology. But this book is, I don't, it's not necessarily about kidfluencers being victims, but it's more about thinking about like what they're doing in the space and who it's serving, because it's not necessarily serving them as the content creators.
Mhm.
I don't know. That was a roundabout way of answering your question.
But that's also the nuance we're looking for, right? Because what I mean, we could claim, or I could say, well, I made the same mistake. I just framed this as kids, right? Co-opting AI kids, but that is a huge category, and so many different humans fall sort of into that category broadly. Annabelle, just talking about kids as agents or designers, I want to ask you, what are some ways in which you have seen institutions create spaces for that idea, for AI and play, for kids as designers, also vis-a-vis all of the harms that we know about, right? That we know generative AI systems in particular can produce, and that we don't have reliable technical approaches for mitigating for. Any outside of research, perhaps, knowledge about these interventions that you could share?
Yeah, I think that's a big question. Um, I don't think we're doing enough in industry to involve young people. And I also don't think we're doing enough to use the extensive research and understanding we already have of how young people use digital technology to use that as foresight into what we likely think will happen. Character AI, for example, very much just like put this technology out there, seeing it as an experiment. Young people are being experimented on, and I think we need to push technology companies to be more responsible rather than saying, well, we don't know what's going to happen. We are able to foresee a lot of the harms that have come on young people, not only based on what we already know, but also just by involving young people earlier on. It's quite difficult as a practitioner. I understand it's quite difficult as a practitioner in industry to access young people, and we need to do that also responsibly. But just because it's difficult doesn't mean we don't do it, or just because it's slower doesn't mean we don't do it. I also go a little bit further than just saying we should involve young people in designing technology for young people. But I also think we should use young people in designing technology for grown-ups too. And I've spoken about this internally in my company quite a lot, and I encourage teams who are designing creative technology to use young people as co-designers because they don't come with any of the like rigid sensibilities that we have around technology. So I have so many examples of when I'm talking to adults and I'm showing them this new kind of scrappy tool. And you sort of leave it open to them to like poke and prod, and they still poke and prod it in ways that like traditional technology would work because I think they don't want to look silly and they're just so used to technology working a certain way. Conversely, I put technology in front of young people, technology that our machine learning engineers and technologists think is really fantastic, and a child already just asks something of that tool that is just so far beyond its capabilities. I'll give it a practical example. This was years and years ago. We were just putting image generators in front of young people, with even adults. We were testing this out, early on in Canva. And I had maybe a 7-year-old who typed into an image generator that we had put a rock on a hill. And we made a picture of a rock on a hill, and that young person was like, amazing, and then typed, now make it roll down the hill like really fast and then like explode in flames, and wanted it to animate and do all these different things. And of course, this was an image generator. It couldn't also make this. Now these things, now you can do these things years later. But at the time, these young people were like, yes, anding this technology in ways that we weren't getting the insights, we weren't getting these examples from like adults. So we're not doing enough in designing technology for young people. I think we're missing out on interesting ideas and fluid interactions in designing for older people as well, and also for creative and playful technologies. There was more in your question though, Mona. Was there anything that sparks
Well,
that
I guess
we still need to
so.
unpack?
Maybe I can open this to, or I would like to open this to the panel. And as I do that, I'm inviting our audience members to put more questions into our Q&A box. My question is about institutions such as higher ed, schools, neighborhood groups, things like this. In part because we have been in the AI regulation space for a little bit now, and we've been in the space of children's right for a bit now, and we've been in the space of um, creating at least in industry spaces for creative exchange and exploration, right? But yet we are in a really complicated situation, it seems, right now when it comes to AI and kids, and we have all this experimentation going on, but we also have all these harms that we know of. And it seems that sort of more small scale interventions, environments that are a little bit more perhaps smaller and more controllable, such as a university or a school or a community, can at that smaller scale perhaps wrap their heads around these complicated questions more decidedly and with more of an effect, as we are dealing with the complications of regulation. So I guess my question for all of you is, what can we do as educators in schools and in higher ed to address these points that all of you have made? And I'm asking that question because I get asked that question a lot, Sonia.
Well, maybe I can start because we're doing a lot of work at the moment about in schools and asking about how all kinds of technologies are used in schools. And now, of course, we're asking about AI. So I think a there's some really interesting reasons for asking about schools because schools are largely publicly funded. So there is a kind of evident kind of public responsibility there, and yet that budget adds up to a lot of money. So added up, it could be sufficient to kind of say to big tech, and big tech largely provides educational resources in schools. It's enough to say we don't want the data collected and used for R&D, or we want to make sure that these safety protections are there, or you meet certain educational standards. Governments by and large are not doing that, though there are a few. The Netherlands has been kind of bravely standing up, and I think also Denmark, and saying, Google, you cannot do this in our schools unless you meet our standards and expectations. But it's hard for individual schools to do that. And yet the school is such an authority for, and this may be different in different parts of the world, but it seems to me, at least in Britain, it's such an authority for both the children and the parents. So they can't kind of go to big tech and say, what have you done with our data? Or, why have you designed this in a way that just teaches to the test and never lets me use my imagination? Or, whatever it is that people are concerned about. They want the school to be responsible, but each school is a very small, hard-pressed, underfunded set of people who know about teaching and don't necessarily know about regulation or data or tech. And so children have to do what their school provides. Opt-outs make it super hard for everybody. And yet it's very hard to make the big tech fit the public needs and the children's needs in all the diverse ways that, schools are so variable. So I don't have an answer. I have a very strong sense of the problem, and we're doing our research now, and we're listening very carefully to what the teachers are saying, the kids, the unions, and so on.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Ashleigh, what do you think? I mean, we're colleagues, right? We're being asked these questions a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah, and this is an issue that comes up a lot in the classes that I teach about social media. So like I'm having these conversations a lot with my students. And well, my college students, right? And so one of the things that they bring up a lot is similar to what Sonia just said about how we talk a lot about implementing things like digital literacy or like AI literacy earlier, like in K through 12 programs, but that requires money to train teachers or librarians or whoever like within the school systems to do this work. So one of the things that um, students have offered, or various students have offered as like a not like a complete solution, but maybe an alternative to thinking about how do we incorporate formal education at like the primary and secondary level is like organizing community groups. And you had mentioned something about like neighborhoods or neighborhood organizations, and they were saying that like they said that because one of the challenges is that um, sometimes parents aren't aware, like individually, of some of the things that are happening or some of the ways that their children are being impacted by social media. But like as people come together and collaborate, then that's an opportunity to both share information and resources. So I think like maybe until we can secure better money for our public schools, um, we can encourage communities to come together around um, addressing these issues that we're seeing with children and AI. Yeah, and I mean, like people who are educators already could be people who are leading those kinds of community initiatives. Because I think sometimes also people, it can be, one end or the other sometimes, but sometimes people feel like more comfortable with an expert in the room. And then sometimes people are like, well, we actually don't want to hear what you have to say. But I think that like we could, as educators, offer education in spaces outside of our classrooms.
Thank you for that, Ashley. And I think that that sort of point of creating community within institutions is really interesting and relevant. And it seems that kids are already doing that. Kids want to be with other kids and relate to one another, right? I'm going to bring in the audience questions now, I promise. And Annabelle, I'm going to start with you. This one is for you. What are sort of the top three things you think schools should teach children about AI?
Yeah, I was actually about to answer that one and connect it to what Ashley was just saying then about AI literacies. I think when we think about AI literacies, we think, well, let's tell people how machine learning works. Let's teach kids about like training data. That is important. But sometimes the language that I hear, it is so focused on te telling children this AI is not real. It's not a real person. And I think that that ignores the fact that, you have a real experience, though, of talking to the characters. And young people now have, I think, a finer grained understanding of tech, like this technology. It's that it's not alive, but it is still real to them. It's maybe doesn't feel, but it might think, and they walk away from a conversation or experience. Like, I showed those examples of like angsty play. They walk around feeling emotionally affected by it. And so I would like to see more AI literacy talking about like relationship literacy around negotiating with another thinking partner. And so we can look to sort of the maybe the materials and the lessons we teach around developing healthy relationships with humans, and we can adapt that to talking about, what is it like to have this role play with a character? When do you feel like an idea has been presented to you that you maybe didn't think of yourself? How do you push back on it? So yeah, I would like to see maybe less like just shutting off the conversation by just telling young people this is not real, I'm not a real person, and recognizing the experience they're having and sort of working through that, like relationally, and emotionally as well. So maybe they're not the top three things. That's just like one thing I would like to see developed more.
One big thing. Well, that's even better, right? Thank you for that, Annabelle. Sonia, I have a question for you about identity and identity development. And that was a very early question that came in. whether you have seen any signs of generative AI or algorithmic systems shaping children's identity development. And if I may add on to that question, is that also a concern in the regulatory discourse at all? Children's identity formation in AI.
It's a really good question, and it's a really hard question. And the simple answer I would say is it's not being talked about anything like as much as some of the harms and some of the kind of literacy questions, like what do we want kids to understand if they're going to be engaging in this world. So I think we don't yet know. What we can see, what we do know is that when kids engage with AI, it feeds back some kind of it feeds back a version of the world that can be biased, that can be have some of the stupidities in the world kind of amplified. It can make the judgments that can seem really harsh to a child just kind of exploring. But it can also seem very empathetic and encouraging of a kind of expression and something inchoate that children, need to have kind of gently drawn out. So it can just do such very different things. And part of it is down to obviously, how the kids kind of prompt it, how they engage, how they interact. It's partly down to what ways in which maybe they have different identity needs that they end up engaging with it in different ways. So it feels to me, I often feel this, it's like it kind of intensifies things. It could really be helpful in bringing out and scaffolding and enabling a kind of identity development that the child is kind of maybe already part way on. It can just kind of slam them back and give them something super prejudiced or super judgy, or biased, or just wrong, in ways that we may not grasp. So it intensifies that quite fragile and very important process of identity development. But we need to do, more research is needed to follow up some of these things. Some of them time really will tell, and that'll be sad because it may be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to add to that, Sonia. The paper in particular that I mentioned that's coming out soon, we do actually talk about this like identity exploration. We saw many examples of that, particularly on character AI. We break it down as like we saw examples of young people seeking like motivations for intents around restoration, exploration, and transformation. And transformation, we saw a lot of identity play. Some examples of that was them, creating characters for proxies, like characters that represent real people in their lives, sort of sandboxing and doing simulations. You can also uniquely in character AI create personas. So you write like a system prompt for how the system will receive your responses as well as the character. And young people spoke about creating personas that they would project onto. Sometimes they were really heightened. So, like during their period, they might have a persona that is a demon that has apocalyptic periods and her father casts her out. And they're playing these like really emotionally fantastical and very heightened, experiences. They're making clones with superpowers. So it's them, but enhanced. And I think that we've spoken a lot about what the system could do to shape identity when we think about bias, and we have now new ways of like measuring the level of bias, and we can talk about stereotypes. But there is other types of ways in which the system subtly reinforces or guides, ideas around identity that we're yet to properly measure. To the person who answered that, you asked that question, you might go look at like recently Anthropic did research around like disempowerment or ideas around emotional bubbles. But what we do know is that models respond quite differently to the emotional valence of a prompt. So neutral prompts, we're pretty good at understanding how neutral prompts like maybe keep a model within the constraints that we've designed for it as the model designers. Very hard to understand how the models respond to emotional prompts. Who is giving emotional prompts? Teenagers. And the way that they're prompting is really causing this volatility in models. And we are yet to like properly take responsibility for that and measure that as technologists. So extremely important question. And agree with Sonia, like just so much more focus needed on it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Annabelle. Ashleigh, one of the things I think you're putting your finger on is the relationship between parents, children, social media, and AI. And of course, we cannot think AI without social media. I think at this point, for various reasons, in part, this is where a lot of the data comes from. This is where a lot of AI is actually being developed. It seems to me that in the same way in which there are new expectations, pressures on educators, there are new expectations, implicit or explicit, on parents when it comes to this really intense relationship between AI and social media. What do you share with parents who ask you about navigating that?
Um, I think one of the main things that I share with parents is that it's important for them to have conversations with their children about what they are like, not what they're doing on social media in a way that's like surveillance, like, what are you doing? But like, who are you engaging with? How is it making you feel? What kinds of things do you think about, like, as a result of, what you're doing on social media or like with AI? Like, how are you using it? How does it make you feel to use it? Do you get frustrated? Like, to have like very real conversations, not just about the content of what they're doing, but how it's making them feel and what it's making them think about. Because I think that even outside of social media and AI, we don't have these conversations with kids enough. And so I think that because we already maybe weren't having these conversations a lot, then when social media and AI are introduced, it makes things more complicated because there's more of a disconnect between what parents think their children are doing and feeling and what their children are actually doing and feeling. And so I think it's just really important to talk, and not in a way that's like judgmental or trying to like, or disciplinary, like saying like, oh, well, you can't do X, Y, and Z, but like just asking, what's going on? What are you doing? What are you thinking? What are you feeling?
Which is also something we want among adults, right?
Mhm.
And with that, we are at time. I want to sincerely thank Annabelle Blake, Ashleigh Greene Wade, and Sonia Livingstone. This was a conversation that spanned the globe. We have London, Sydney, and Charlottesville, which is wonderful. Thank you so much for your contributions. Dear audience members, thank you for joining us. Please look up the work of Annabelle, Sonia, and Ashleigh. They have books, papers, Substacks, and there are public scholars in all the ways. Thank you for joining us today. We have our next conversation in March, on March 25th at 4 p.m. Eastern, and we will talk about something completely different, which is insurance and the calculation of risk with and through AI systems. And I'm delighted to be welcoming Lawrence Berry and Jathan Sadowski, who is also in Australia. So it's a little bit of a theme here. Thank you so much, everybody. My sincere gratitude to my inspiring panelists, and thank you, audience members, for joining us today.